Welcome everybody to our annual review of 2019, the very best public art from around the globe. Thank you so much for joining us and tuning in. We can see a lot of you there tuning in from a lot of different places. So thanks for making time and for being with us today. I'm Natasha Smith and I'm leader of UAP's curatorial teams.
And hi, I'm Ineke, Dane. I'm one of UAP's curators.
We've just got a little technical error with our slide changes, so just give us a moment. Let's see if we can get that going. There we go, fantastic. So as you can see, we are recording this, so we'll be sharing that recording as well. And there is the option, of course, to ask us questions if you like. We'll probably get to those towards the end, but don't hold back. We'd love to hear your thoughts and we'd love to answer those for you as well. So we're actually speaking to you today from the UQ Art Museum here in Brisbane, which is a fabulous place to be. And I'd like to say a very big thank you to UQ's Senior Curator, Peter Reck, for helping to actually facilitate this space. And of course, all the wonderful staff that do work here. I'd also like to say a really big thank you to Artsy, who's our media partner, and Artsy's actually published this fantastic list as of yesterday, which you can catch live, and they've shared that with their over 1.4 million subscribers globally, so we're really thankful, and it's a great platform. Today, Ineke and I are going to start to walk you through this list in a little bit more depth, with a few more anecdotes perhaps, and we'd like to just talk a little bit also about the fabulous curators that have helped us make this list. We've got Nicholas Baume, who's Director and Chief Curator at the Public Art Fund, Julia Friedman, Senior Curatorial Manager at Madison Square Park Conservancy, Natalie King, Curator and Editor, Venus Lau, Artistic Director, K11 Art Foundation, and Nick Mitzevich, Director of the National Gallery of Australia. This fabulous group of 5 have worked tirelessly to pull this list together in collaboration with UAP's own curatorial teams. And without further ado, we'll dive on in.
Thanks, Natasha. So as you just mentioned, Nicholas Baume has led the creative vision of Public Art Fund in New York City for the past decade now, since 2009. And his very first highlight for the year 2019 is actually an Australian permanent public art commission by a German artist, Sabine Honig, and it's titled Shadows. This work was about 4 years in the making. I actually worked on it with the curator Barbara Flynn back in 2017 doing plant research with Sabina when she came out to her visit and document the plants that then formed the basis of this work. I think this is a really beautiful work. As you can see, it's quite kaleidoscopic and it throws incredible shadows. They're prints on glass that span about 170 metres of the Barangaroo International Towers in Sydney. And it's a gesture to pre-colonial species. There's Gymea lilies, Wollemi pine, Angophora and Banksia, amongst other species. And it kind of indicates what once was on the site. So Sabina actually consulted a lot with Indigenous agriculture experts to realise the commission. I think it's really nice that this heroes nature in a cathedral-like way, rather than religion being the winner. We're going back to an idea of learning from the environment and everything that surrounds us. Kind of a stained glass quality there.
And perhaps a bit of a nod to one of the themes that starts to emerge in this list overall. It truly is a great example of art built into the fabric of a place that becomes permanent, really stunning outcome. Now from this quite, I guess, subtle and very poignant conversation between nature and built form, we move now to a more perhaps robust dialogue, but still incredibly elegant, had in light. And this is actually across geographical borders and between the people that experience their divide. We travel from Barangaroo to the US-Mexico border. And this is Nicholas's second nomination by the artist Rafael Lozano-Hema, and his work's entitled Border Tuner. Rafael's a Mexican artist. He's an absolute master of light and new media. And I think it's no surprise that Nicholas has nominated this work. I mean, not only for its engagement, its interactivity, but also for its incredible sophistication and bold and dynamic impact. The work was installed at the border, as I mentioned, and formed chiefly through light. And Lozano Hema, in Nicholas's words, was able to brilliantly and poetically render intimate bridges of light between strangers, standing in two different cities and countries that share so much and are yet, of course, divided.
This is a beautiful work. It lasted only 17 nights, but it had a prolific public program which accompanied the light beams. I think the key here is interconnectivity with the public participants at the border. It just reminded me of an article I read in a financial magazine a few years ago, which said that if people were allowed to move freely, conservative estimates were that worldwide GDP would double overnight. And that's because when people move, they're moving to be more prosperous in a country. They're often of working age with a family. They want to be there. I thought an interesting fact was that this was realised through the endorsement of the US Department of Homeland Security, which is notoriously rigid, and it just shows the power of art to navigate those kind of boundaries and bureaucracy.
A hopeful thought. And I think also, it's a really lovely roundup of Nicholas's two contributions, both very powerful and poignant works. Next up, we have Julia Friedman, who is Senior Curatorial Manager at Madison Square Park Conservancy. And Julia most recently worked on the US Pavilion at the 2019 Venice Biennale. Julia's first nomination is one that's actually incredibly close to our hearts at UAP, not only because this work is very, very important socially and politically, of course, in the US where it was commissioned, but also because it was something that UAP was able to be involved in. We actually helped to fabricate this work under the oversight of the artist from our Shanghai Foundry. So Rumours of War is by Kinder Wiley, and it was installed at Times Square in New York. It's an incredibly provocative piece, of course, a monumental bronze with a blackened patina that you can see there standing on that beautiful sort of pediment. It's emulated or sort of made to evoke this idea at first glance of a Confederate soldier atop his horse. Of course, it's not a white male soldier on a horse. When we look closer, we see that it is actually a black man, a young black man at that. He's got dreadlocks, he's got contemporary clothing, he's wearing sneakers, and there's something really sort of bold and engaging about this. Julia Friedman states quite incredibly with her use of language. I just read a little bit because I think she wrote some really beautiful comments here. She says, the inspiration for Rumours of War is war. It's an engagement with violence. New York and Times Square sit at the crossroads of human movement on a global scale, and to have the Rumours of War sculpture presented in such a context lays bare the scope and scale of the project in its conceit to expose the beautiful and terrible potentiality of art to sculpt the language of domination. The brilliance of Wiley's sculpture is in its complex reckoning, giving power and majesty to a population not often portrayed with these ideals, whilst also questioning the values engendered by memorials to masculine state-sanctioned violence. Incredibly powerful commentary there from Julia, and right on point. It's interesting, I think, to note that this work starts to pick up on one of the common themes or kind of trends that we're seeing in this year's list, which is the use of the monument as a kind of device. We saw this actually back in 2017 when Nicholas, Baume and I were looking at the list, and we particularly noticed it a lot in Documenta in quite a few of those works. So it's interesting to see that thing come back.
Yeah, I think this work is so very, very on point with the rewriting of history across all the disciplines that we're seeing at the moment. It exemplifies the breadth and agency of public art to garner attention of audiences en masse, because the visual can so prolifically transcend written or other communication methods. So that takes us to our second work nominated by Julia. Simone Lee's Brick House. I was very excited to see this work nominated. I've been following Simone's practice for a while now, and this is the inaugural Highlight Commission in New York City. Simone simultaneously had exhibitions at the Guggenheim and the Whitney Biennale, which I think shows the appetite of her work at the moment in its urgency. The work engages with representations of race and gender, but it also references the architectural styles of clay houses or dwellings in Cameroon and Chad, parts of Africa. And I think we all know the colloquial fairy tale in where the brick house cannot be blown down. And that's talking about the strength and endurance of a people and self-determination, including an ode to female subjectivity of sorts, I think.
I think it's also interesting because, again, we're seeing this kind of use of almost like the monument or that kind of device through this work, like we did with Gehinda. And I think, you know, when you look at this, it's sort of standing tall and espousing its message, as Gehinda's does a different message, perhaps a more feminine and in a softer way, but it's still bold and it's got this kind of gravitas, and it's definitely leveraging that use of monuments. So again, that theme's really interesting. And I think what we have here, which is lovely, you know, Julia has recommended 2 pieces from her city and 2 incredible pieces on the global kind of scale. So brilliant.
It's a really wonderful work to see in person. So our next curatorial voice is Natalie King. She's an Australian curator and currently working on her 2nd Venice Biennale appointment. She's curator of the 2021 New Zealand Pavilion with artist Yuki Kihara. And her first nomination is Jenny Holzer, Vigil. This was a very brief creative time project in New York City, projections on the Rockefeller Center. And it directly confronts gun violence in the US. It's a text-based work, as you can see. They're poems, including those from teenagers who grew up in the shadow of mass murder. Text-based work is Jenny Holzer's forte. She shapes text into artworks that question and cut through the entrenched paradigms of our times, and she does this by manipulating policy, leaked reports, redacted documents, for example.
I think here we see another interesting kind of thread or theme that's coming through our selection, and this is that ability of the artist to harness their power and their practice to directly engage in political dialogues. And I think it's something we've kind of taken note of. This whole list is very serious. There's not an awful lot of fun in the list this year, and I think it's a kind of a reflection of the space we're in. And we'll see more of that as we move through. You know, the artists are playing a really serious role in having a direct dialogue about these issues. Of course, here with Jenny, it's around the issue of gun violence and the prevalence of that. And I think what's so kind of deft of her is that she's just gone ahead and used the voices of victims, of those directly affected by this and by this loss, and that power of harnessing that voice is so critical and just kind of cuts through all the opinion.
Gives the victims an incredible amount of agency and perhaps an antidote to some of that horror that they've experienced. Yeah.
So we move now from these incredibly beautiful, emblazoned, but of course very sad messages, and we move now to a smaller community shrine of messages, which is actually captured in a leafy suburb of South Eveleigh here in Australia, in Sydney. This is Natalie's 2nd nomination, and it goes to Nell for the Eveleigh Treehouse, Maitland in Sydney. This work is actually made from steel, and Nell describes this as a secular gum leaf temple, which I think is a really beautiful concept. She produced the work through Eveleigh Works, which is actually one of the oldest continuing blacksmith sites in the world, which is incredible. And she made it with the support directly of local communities. So again, kind of giving agency to the community directly. 2 houses were designed to resemble native gum trees that were in the area. And Nell actually hosted 24 community workshops, and she had over 400 members of community come in and volunteer, and they were able to actually forge their own individual metal gum leaves, which were then used to make the actual structures. And I think this is lovely. Participants were actually invited to leave their name or perhaps their initials as a part of that. And what ended up actually happening is Nell noted that many people left a name or the initials of a loved one that might have been really unwell or possibly deceased. So this is why she hence kind of refers to it as this secular gum leaf temple, or this kind of shrine.
Yeah, I think although there's this incredible human element entrenched in the work, I can't help thinking about the tree houses as bird hides, or a place to watch and observe nature. And I think that's a nice common theme in our two Sydney nominated works, both permanent commissions, that they're heroing and celebrating nature.
Yes, it is a good dialogue to be having in this country, hopefully being noticed. Next up, we're going to move to our next contributor, which is Venus Lau, who's the former artistic director of K11 Art Foundation and a China-based, very well-known independent curator. Venus's nomination goes to an artist that I greatly admire, Shanghai-based, Xu Zhen, and it's for his work entitled The Evolution Multifunctional Trainer. This curious work is cited in the northernmost province of China, and it's actually on the island of Chongming. And the work is cited within an art centre which Xu Zhen and his team actually helped to set up. So a really nice kind of context there for the work and its environment. Venus states about this work that it consists of this oversized kind of exercise machine. I'll just click to the image you can see there, with this unbelievable amount of kind of mass and feeling of power that just can't be controlled by the average person. Ultimately, of course, the work within its kind of supersized scale loses that functionality, but presents a superhero power and an architectural aspect, as well as an inherent aesthetic of simplicity, she says. She also goes on to say that it embodies the human illusion of its own ability and infinite power and its pursuit of power. And she also shared with us that this kind of exercise equipment is really common in a lot of parks throughout China. So in its own way, it's kind of like its own form of a public art icon, this kind of structural sculpture that people come across all the time. And also she says, of course, it is a product of the political administration and this kind of outward gesture of health and well-being for the public, but also this kind of aid to productivity and you know, in society and in the workplace as well. I think it's a really interesting piece. For me, I sort of made an abstract link as well to climate change. When I look at this kind of enormous piece, it makes me think about how, you know, we imagine ourselves as kind of these all-powerful humans, but we need to take this step back and start to think about the environment that we're a part of and the world around us, and that we need to start to be a part of that system, you know, in harmony.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think this is a pop parody of sorts on the pursuit of power and the redundancy of this. And you know, everyone knows now in China there's a sheer compromise of communism towards capitalism. And the setting, I think, is really interesting because it's this shiny new object juxtaposed with an abandoned or perhaps a future repurposed building, but it's very apparent, the line between the new and the old and what's left, what we leave after we eventually move on. So that brings us to our very last contributor, Nick Mitzevich. He's the director of the National Gallery of Australia, but he actually used to direct UQ Art Museum, where we're sitting just now. And he has nominated 2 projects, and they both interestingly originated from a sketch. So the first up is Rail San Fratello, an architecture firm, and they've created the work Tita Tota Wall. This one is also on the US-Mexico border, and it seems to be a brief poem of sorts to the human cost of the divide. The work actually only lasted 30 minutes, but it's this brief kind of moment of play and joy that we can imagine would be remembered for years to come. So it just shows that for a work to be enduring, it can also be ephemeral, I think. And as the next slide will probably show, there is a real amount of joy and interaction within this work. He obviously didn't collaborate with the Homeland Security, as Lorenzo Hammer did. So, but it shows the activist kind of streak in the work, which I think is very brave.
Yeah, it's also kind of an interesting juxtaposition because it is kind of set up to be this fun and playful, thing on face value, but at the same time it's, this kind of overt act of activism, and it's sort of probably known to the artist that it would have this really short life. And, there's kind of an inherent sadness just in that joy being cut short as well, which gives a kind of, extra layer of poignancy to the work. For Nick's second nomination, we actually travel away from this kind of social, geographical and political divide to an equally pressing and I think urgent topic. And that is, of course, the topic of climate change. And move away from this kind of dry and barren landscape to the work by Klaus Littmann, which is For Forests, the Unending Attraction of Nature. And this is by the Swiss artist and was installed actually in Austria. The work is sited in an empty stadium, and it comprised of 300 trees which are kind of erupting out of the playing field, which is quite fabulous to look at aesthetically. And of course the trees just naturally shift and change with the seasons, obviously all the colours as well for the environment that they're in. Nick really wanted to highlight, when he put this nomination forward, the importance of the conversation that it's having with climate change. And what he loved about it is how the artist put the viewer into the role of the spectator and asked them to kind of think about that. So he says, by viewing the work from the grandstands, it asks us, are we content to simply be the spectators as our forests are logged and burned, and do we need to take more drastic action to preserve them? And he goes on to note, as Ineke mentioned, that the work originates from a sketch, which is really interesting, from about 1970 to 71. It was a pencil drawing by an Austrian artist, Max Painter, which was fascinating. It was actually imagined, the artist imagined a time when forests might only exist as exhibition objects. Quite a frightening prospect. Let's hope that is not prophetic. But, I think it is a kind of a warning in a way. And Littmann's installation is, I guess, equally enthralling and haunting. And of course, a timely reminder to us all, I think, of the future that we're facing with the natural world during our current climate crisis and with the rapid deforestation that's occurring.
Yeah, I mean, this work reminds me kind of acutely of artists like Agnes Denis. I mean, she's only gaining acclaim in her 80s for work that she began over 5 decades ago. I mean, I think this year we've seen unprecedented attention on climate change. It really emphasizes how much we need the resourcefulness of artists, the creativity of artists to lead the way and find new paradigms for change, I think. Also, interestingly, this is a 32,000 seat stadium, which Littmann actually negotiated and convinced to have empty for the duration of this project, which shows a huge amount of in-kind support, which is quite refreshing, I think.
Absolutely fantastic. So on that sobering but also, I guess, hopeful note, we move to UAP's first nominations. There we are, double, apologies. And to an astonishingly beautiful dialogue between the artist Johannes Skars and also a Melbourne-based architecture firm, Edition Office. The work, entitled In Absence, is the NGV's 5th annual architecture commission, and it was created by the two in collaboration. I think this temporary work has only just opened, but it will be open until April in 2020. It's a piece that ultimately invites visitors to consider the fallacy of terra nullius, which of course declared Australia to be an empty continent awaiting ownership. The work speaks very much to Aboriginal history and to practices around aquaculture, agriculture, food, harvesting and architecture, and really acknowledges First Nations knowledge and skills and history, and really makes us think about that knowledge that was there long before colonisation occurred. Standing at 9 metres and rising as a cylindrical monolith, the piece is timber-clad, and it has this kind of imposing and yet calm vibe. It's monumental but also inviting. It's an exercise, I think, in sculpting with light. It's really beautiful. It focuses the eye to where light enters the structure from above. There's also this subtle sense of ash that comes through the space, which adds a kind of somber tone, but also a really enthralling and entirely captivating sensory experience. Scars created 16,000 hand-blown glass yams, which you can see attached to the interior of the cylindrical chambers. And these actually gradually secrete a kind of murky substance through the life of the exhibition. So there's this kind of patinaing that occurs over time as well. And also this kind of reveal, I guess, if you visit the work multiple times. I wonder when I look at this, if this is again, a kind of monument, a sense of that monument device coming through. Is it a place to honour? Is it a place to grieve? It almost feels like it's crying with those yams, tears coming down. There's a sense of the chambers of the heart captured in the form. I also think, though, it's optimistic. It's a place that does invite you in, and perhaps it's a place to gather and to learn. Is it imposing or is it inviting? I don't know. I sort of love that it's all these things. I think as an Australian, I'm very excited by this work, and it, you know, leaves a deep impression upon me. And I think that it provokes this really active dialogue with the living history of this land, which is so sorely needed.
Yeah, I think this is a stunning work. I can't wait to visit it. It looks completely arresting, and I think it's particularly exciting, as you mentioned, in our country. We're notoriously behind the world in, you know, discussions and moving forward and like breaking old ways of thinking, particularly in self-determination. Maybe that's in part due to the fact we're in the Antipodes, but we are rapidly catching up with the rewriting of our history, which particularly here is very relevant because a lot was not written on the confrontation between colonial settlers and Indigenous people in Australia particularly. So that brings us to UAP's second nomination, and as we all know, it was a Venice Biennale year this year, and we wanted to put forward Thomas Saraceno's Erosine project. The full title is When Breath Becomes Air, When Atmospheres Become Movement for a Post-Fossil Fuel Era Against Carbon Capitalist Clouds. I wanted to mention the materials of this because I think it's quite interesting that Thomas has chosen to note that alongside the actual physical elements of the work, that rising tides, the moon, rain, wind, ships, global warming, and the capitalocene, which I imagine is a word that he has coined, merging the Anthropocene with capitalism, they are all influencing this work, which really has, as you can see, a feather-like materiality, but its footprint actually extended from the light that got refracted and shadows that cast across the entire soffit of this, you can't quite see it there, but an entire open-air pavilion. And Thomas notes that the work imagines an ethical collaboration with the atmosphere environment and environment free from borders and free from fossil fuels. There is an accompanying soundscape, and this was almost a homage to Venice's flood warning system, which became quite prophetic actually, because it was echoed in real time just last month by Venice's highest aqua alta since 1966. Very on point with the theme of climate change. But I think Saraceno's work actually kind of just explodes beyond the thinking of anything else we're seeing. It's trying to imagine a new world and the tools that we will need to exist in it, rather than just sheerly creating metaphors or commentary on what's happening.
Yes, he's a real kind of future creative, I think. And it definitely was prophetic, you know, bearing in mind the aqua alta. I think what's really stunning about this work is it's bringing that theme again of climate change, but very much to the fore, but it's doing it in this really kind of attractive way. It almost kind of woos you to think about it. It's so incredibly beautiful on first glance. It's incredibly accessible and engaging and inviting. And what I also liked about the work is because it had these kind of reflective surfaces, we become a part of the piece. And in a way, it invites us to consider our place in that environment too, which I think is really beautiful.
Yeah. There was definitely a choreography of sorts by the light refracted and directed by the elements, and to profile non-human the ability of the non-human to move forward, then we're getting a time check here, so we'll keep going.
Keep going.
We have one more project.
We do, and it's interesting because we're going from a single work in a biennale to an entire biennial,
which we actually took a cue from Emma Enderby, who last year nominated an entire biennale for her selection. This time it's the Toronto Biennial, and it's the inaugural biennial in Toronto, curated by Candice Hopkins and Tyrone Bastian, called The Shoreline Dilemma. We chose this because we're seeing a kind of a trend also at the moment of Canada being exemplary in providing a stage for preeminent voices of First Nations creatives in recarving histories, but also paths for the future, and all this within kind of a global context. We really enjoyed this site specificity, and they use the geographical location on Lake Ontario as a launch point for these global dialogues. The big question, what does it mean to be in relation? They noted the significant alterations of the site over the past 12,000 years as a result of colonialism and industrialization, and the shifting tide lines and shapes of the lake as kind of a metaphor for the fact that nothing ever stays the same, and evolution over time. And what we're seeing right now is Lou Shepherd's sound work of Dawn Chorus. I was particularly drawn to. I quite like the austerity of sound works and the minimal footprint of them. And this was a sonic harmonization of bird songs.
Well, that concludes our official nominations, 12 incredible works. You can see kind of a quick summary there visually of all of those. Of course, in coming up with a list like this, it's very hard to make choices. I know all of our contributors found it very difficult, and you know, there was of course a lot of research done, a lot of projects considered, and I think overall it's been an incredibly productive year, and there's been just an outpouring of really great quality public art. We did want to just make a few honourable mentions. We had 3 other projects that were just so close to making the list, so we'll just talk about those very briefly. So first up was actually one that Julia Friedman wanted to put forward as an honourable mention, and this is Leonardo Drew's work, which is City in the Grass in Madison Square Park in New York City. Again, Julia, I think, fiercely promoting fantastic New York City art, which is great to see, and of course, why shouldn't she? It's such a home of art. This piece was like a kind of carpet unfolding through the park, and it transformed that park into this really playful space for all ages. People could sit, have their lunch, kids could play and scramble over things, and you know, of course, it was just this really inviting space. I think what it does is it transforms the park. You know, New York is a city renowned for its parks, but it turns them into a different kind of space and shifts up their functionality. UAP was honoured to actually help fabricate this work from our New York-based studio as well, and working very closely with the artist.
Our next nomination actually comes from us here at UAP, and it's Alicia Claudia's Parapet at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Met New York City Rooftop Commission. I really love the underpinnings of Alicia Claudia's work, which kind of question our understanding and place in the universe. And she says this great kind of rationale behind the work, which it documents a fictional universe that plays by different rules. They allegorize our confrontation with the mysteries that scientific inquiry has failed to tame, and the flights of imagination that result from our inability to comprehend the wilds of the universe. I particularly love that last part, because we put so much effort into trying to define and put parameters on the universe, but as she quite actually says, it is wild, essentially, at the end of the day, and we'll never be able to fully understand it.
Such a beautiful juxtaposition of that work with the skyline beyond as well.
Beautifully cited. Sometimes if you look at it from the right direction, these marble balls, they're actually from 9 different places across the world. The marble is sourced from, they almost look like they're sitting atop the skyscrapers there.
Brilliant.
So the last work is Assad Raz's Caldor Public Art Project. It's the 34th Caldor Public Art Project in their 50th year. And it was at the clothing store in Carriage Works in Sydney, titled Absorption. And what Asad Raza has created is 300 tons of compost, essentially. He calls it Anthropocene soil. It's made up of sand, legumes, cuttlebone, coffee, green waste. And he says of the work that it's something that can really only be made from humans. It's a very visceral experience, or was. It was only lasting a couple of weeks, but it really makes you think about, cities won by nature, the eventual kind of, the fact that nature takes back in a sense.
So that is the summary, including honourable mentions as well. And I guess I just wanted to kind of, before we jump to a few questions, just take a moment to summarise some of those trends and themes that we saw, because I know last year we really felt there weren't trends or themes. It was quite an eclectic mix, and it was almost diversity that defined it. But this year, it's clear there are very strong trends and very strong themes. And as I noted earlier, there's a kind of seriousness to the tone of all these projects. Even the works that are a little bit more playful, like the teeter-totter wall on the border, we're still seeing, of course, the seriousness at the heart of that work, and the fact that it was shut down so quickly as well. I think what we're seeing is social and community engagement at the fore, and this is very evident in the process of the works and the commissioning of Jenny Holzer's Vigil in particular, and Nell's Everleigh Treehouse, putting the community voice at the fore to define the work. Perhaps most distinct, I think, for us was noticing, of course, strong reoccurring political dialogues around topics such as climate change. And this was, of course, evidenced in Sabina Hornig's work, Klaus Littman's work, and it was also in Nell's work. And human rights, I think we saw this very much at the front or the fore with Kahinda Wiley, again Jenny Holzer, Rael Sanfratello, and of course Raphael Lozano-Hemmer. And finally, that re-emergence of the monument device being so successfully employed in the works of Kahinda Wiley, Simone Lee, and I think also in Ioane Scarce and Edition Office's collaboration. There's a kind of monument vibe to that as well. So really interesting mix of themes and trends, but as I said, a seriousness about it. I think artists are out there, with a strong voice.
I think so too. I mean, thank God for artists forever, I think, because they're the ones that generate new thinking and encourage us to break the rules.
Absolutely.
So we're now going to take a couple of questions. Thanks so much, everyone, for participating. The first question from Baruch is, do you think all public artworks need to have an underlying political or humanitarian concept?
Wow. That's a great question. I mean, I think it's very poignant in terms of the list that we've just seen. Ultimately, I guess the great thing about public art is that it's in the public sphere, it's in the public realm. So, I think naturally you can't have a public art without it having kind of political elements attributed to it, or conversations applied to it, or
social implications.
Absolutely, yeah. Whether that needs to be a driving factor, I would argue no, of course. I mean, I think when you are commissioning an artist or working or curating with an artist, you want the artist to explore the brief or the concept from their practice, and I don't think that necessarily needs to be dictated by a political or a humanitarian concept. But I think ultimately at this time right now, in this year, I think we're seeing that theme come through very strongly.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks for that question.
Next, we've got one that's actually from someone who's decided to be anonymous, and they have said that they've noticed that we've got lots of female artists this year, and that also our contributors are predominantly women. That's a really interesting thing that you've noticed. And they've also asked us if that's a conscious choice.
Well, I think that it's a combination of being a happy accident, because obviously we have no control over the artists that everyone else is contributing. But also, I mean, it's like any underrepresented kind of race, gender in any discipline. Obviously, females are underrepresented consistently still. So of course we turn our minds to that when at least appointing the curators who will then make the selections, for sure.
Yeah, I think we were very excited to have predominantly female contributors, and I think we're seeing in our institutions a real trend, particularly in Australia at the moment, of really supporting female artists. Nick Mitzevich has had a brilliant program running at the National Gallery as well, really focused around that. And I think it's great to see it, and it's something we are conscious of. Definitely, we are.
Thank you. Great question. The third question is from Vivian. What do you think the brief would have been for the Sydney commissions? If we just quickly reach back, they're both permanent commissions, so they're expected to be in the public for 20 years plus.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really good question. I wonder if the person asking that is in the industry or an artist perhaps in the area. I think Sydney is kind of renowned for having a really great Percent for Art approach through public works and major developments. And I think when you look at Sabina's work that we're seeing there, and Nell's works, you're looking at pieces that have been produced to have a permanence. And I think, a brief for that kind of work has a lot of considerations. And, ultimately, I think knowing City of Sydney and knowing the way that they often do prefer to curate, it's often a really open brief, actually. And they really give agency to artists, and they really invite artists to come in and genuinely respond to a space and genuinely respond to where they want to see their work integrated or cited.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And the Percent for Art initiative is amazing in terms of encouraging private developers who will reap the benefits of that site to give back to the community in some way, shape or form. And the fact that the City of Sydney kind of chooses for that to be through public art, not just the City of Sydney, cities now all over the world, is really, really fabulous.
We're going to take one more question and then we will wrap up, because we're conscious that you will have your days or nights to get to. Last question is from Erica, and she's asking, what do you think is the most expensive work? Wow, that's a great question, and probably one that's often on people's minds as well. I mean, I could be cheeky and say that perhaps because we've nominated a whole biennial, that naturally would be quite expensive, but that's a bit of a, I'm sort of not answering the question. So I think if I was to choose, it would have to be one of the sort of large works, the monumental works in bronze, just because of naturally the medium, and also just the engineering and sort of logistics and project management and coordination involved in that kind of piece. So you've obviously got Kahindawali's Rivers of War, and you've also got Simone Lee's beautiful piece. So I would sort of tend to think there would be the more expensive ones. And naturally, even to put a piece in Times Square like Kahindawali's would take an awful lot of project management, coordination, liaison and engineering, because of the nature of that urban space and everything that's going on above and below ground.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree, but I'd also love to throw that question on its head and think what is the least expensive work, perhaps. And I think that would be the sound work, Blue Shepherds in the Toronto Biennale. And it's just, important to remember that public art doesn't have to be financially prohibitive. It's really nice to have gestures that can have as much weight as a giant sculpture, that equally kind of resonate with communities and populations, and just be as powerful in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's probably a wrap from us. So
we do have a couple more questions coming through, but we will respond to those via email. Thanks so much. And sorry we couldn't get to everything.
Thank you. If we didn't get to you, we definitely will come back to you on email. We'd love to answer. We really appreciate your time and effort in asking questions. Thank you again for joining us, and have a lovely day or a lovely night.
Thank you. Ciao.
Bye.